What's stealing your joy? We're constantly bombarded with curated perfection, making us feel inadequate. Comparison creeps in, whispering, "You're not enough." And slowly we start to believe it. It becomes a cycle, a quiet loop of measuring, doubting, adjusting, leaving us feeling empty, unfulfilled, disconnected from what we are actually living. But what if the problem was never life itself? What if it was the lens we're using to see it? What if we stopped comparing and started living our own story, embracing our uniqueness, finding joy not in someone else's highlight reel, but in our own unfolding path? Find your joy. It starts quietly, almost imperceptibly. A glance at someone else's work, their progress, their clarity, their confidence. And then, without permission, something shifts. Your own work, once enough, now feels insufficient. Not because it changed, but because your reference point did. Comparison does not arrive as a decision. It arrives as a habit that feels like awareness. You tell yourself you are simply observing, measuring, learning, improving. But what is happening is more subtle. You are no longer seeing your path as a whole. You are seeing fragments, pieces of your journey, placed beside fragments of others, assembled into a standard no one was ever meant to meet. There is a particular kind of theft that does not take objects. It takes perception, and comparison is precisely that. It does not take your achievements. It reinterprets them. It does not erase your progress. It reframes it as delay. It does not remove your value. It makes you temporarily unable to recognize it. At first, comparison feels useful. It sharpens ambition. It creates direction. It introduces benchmarks. But left unchecked, it stops being a tool and becomes a mirror, not a neutral one, a distorted mirror, one that magnifies what you lack and minimizes what you've built. And the more you look into it, the less you recognize the person standing away from it. There is a silent assumption underneath comparison that life is a single timeline with people moving at different speeds along the same path. But that assumption is false. There are no parallel tracks that align in fairness, no universal pace, no shared starting point, only different conditions, unseen variables, private histories, invisible constraints. Yet comparison ignores all of that. It reduces complexity into a scoreboard. This is why comparison feels so convincing. It flattens reality. It replaces context with ranking. It removes the invisible and leaves only what can be displayed. And in that simplification, something important is lost. Because what you see in others is never their full reality. You see outputs, not processes, results, not repetition, highlights, not hesitation, finished pages, not the revisions behind them, and then you compare it to your own unedited draft of existence. That imbalance is not just unfair, it is structurally misleading. Yet the mind accepts it anyway, because it prefers clarity over accuracy. And comparison offers clarity at the cost of truth. Over time, something else begins to happen. You start living slightly outside of yourself, not fully present in your own process, but constantly orbiting someone else's. You begin to evaluate your actions not by intention, but by imagined external judgment. You stop asking, "Is this meaningful to me?" and start asking, "Is this enough compared to them?" That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because when comparison becomes the reference point, joy stops being internal. It becomes conditional, and anything conditional can be withdrawn at any moment. This is where the phrase emerges. Comparison is the thief of joy, not because it destroys joy directly, but because it relocates it. It moves joy from what is present to what is perceived elsewhere. And elsewhere is always moving. There is always someone further ahead, always someone faster, always someone seemingly more certain. So joy never arrives. It only updates its target. But there is another layer to this. Comparison does not only steal joy, it also distorts effort, because once you are comparing constantly, effort stops being about direction and starts being about validation. You no longer build to create, you build to match. And matching is a moving target designed by people who are not you. At some point, exhaustion becomes inevitable, not because you are doing too little, but because you are doing too much in reference to things that were never yours. The mind was never designed to hold infinite external benchmarks while sustaining internal clarity. Something has to give, and often it is peace. But the most dangerous effect of comparison is not frustration. It is erasure of perception of progress. You forget what yesterday looked like. You forget what was once difficult and is now natural. You forget that movement itself is evidence, because comparison does not track your history. It only updates your deficit. And so a paradox forms. The more you grow, the less it feels like growth, because the reference point grows faster than you do, or appears to. This is why stepping away from comparison is not about lowering standards. It is about restoring accuracy, returning context to perception, remembering that your life is not a derivative of someone else's highlight reel. When comparison fades, something subtle returns. Not sudden happiness, not constant confidence, but something more stable. Continuity of self-perception. The ability to see your process without distortion, to recognize effort without external translation, to measure progress internally where it actually occurs. And in that space, joy becomes less fragile, not because circumstances improve instantly, but because interpretation stabilizes. You are no longer constantly relocated by external reference points. You are anchored again in your own timeline. Comparison will not disappear completely. It is a natural cognitive reflex, but it does not need to lead. It does not need to define direction. It does not need to decide value. It can remain what it was meant to be, a brief observation, not a governing system. Because the moment comparison becomes the lens through which everything is seen, nothing is seen clearly anymore. And what gets lost is not just joy, it is ownership of your own experience. And that is the true theft.